Jazz Sunday is one of the Sundays I most look forward to, and I'm very glad that it occurs on a regular and predictable basis. Thank you again to all these amazing musicians. Please join me in prayer. Lord, help us to see the beauty of your creation in all things and in all people. May we walk in the light of your grace with hearts that cherish each moment and hands that serve all we meet. You have given us the capacity to choose good. Let us choose to live in harmony with your Spirit, embracing the light that you have planted within every soul. Amen. My brothers and sisters, we live in a world that is more connected than ever before through social media, the internet, global communication. But at the same time, many of us feel more disconnected than ever before. It is a paradox. In this age of connection, we are often struggling with loneliness, isolation, and spiritual disconnection. But Jesus offers us a different kind of connection, one that is deeper, more life-giving, and more transformative than anything we can find in this world. Over the next several weeks, we are going to explore this theme of connections, our connection to God, our connection to each other, and our connection to the world around us. But today we begin on focusing on what it means to cherish these connections, how we nurture, protect, and deepen the relationships that God has initiated in our lives. And our grounding text for this series comes from John chapter 15, verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus invites us to stay connected to him, like branches to a vine, because without him, we cannot bear fruit, we cannot grow, and we cannot live fully into the calling that God has placed on our lives. But when we remain in him, when we stay connected, our lives become channels of grace, bearing fruit that lasts. To understand connection in the Christian life, we must start with God's grace. In our Methodist tradition, we recognize that God's grace is at the root of all of our connections. Grace initiates the relationship, it sustains it, and it helps it grow. John Wesley taught that there are three primary forms of grace: prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Each of these forms of grace speaks to a different aspect of our connection with God. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before. Before we even know God, before we think to seek him, his grace is already at work in our lives, preparing the way for us to come into relationship with him. As Wesley himself so powerfully put, everyone has some measure of that light, some faint glimmering ray, which sooner or later, more or less, enlightens every man that cometh into the world. This grace is God's initial invitation, the infrastructure that allows connection to happen. And justifying grace brings us into a relationship with God. It is the moment when we accept God's invitation and are reconciled to him through faith in Jesus Christ. It is when we get into the car and start our journey. And sanctifying grace continues to work in us after we have been justified. This is the grace that helps us grow, that deepens our connection with God, and that transforms us into the likeness of Christ. It is the journey of faith, where we drive closer and closer to our destination of holiness. And in this sermon series, we will be exploring how God's grace undergirds all of our connections. The connections we cherish with God, with others, and even within ourselves are all built on this foundation of grace. At the heart of all these connections is God, the great connector. In John 15:5, Jesus gives us the image of the vine and the branches. Just as branches cannot survive apart from the vine, we cannot live the fullness of our life apart from our connection to Christ. The vine nourishes, sustains, and gives life to the branches. In the same way, God is the source of our life, the one who connects us to himself and to each other. Without this connection, we lose our vitality. We wither. But when we remain connected to the vine, when we stay in relationship with Christ, our lives bear fruit. And Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace fits beautifully into this imagery. He taught that everyone has some measure of light. God's grace touches every single person, inviting us to grow, to be nourished, to bear fruit. This light, this prevenient grace, is like the life force that flows from the vine to the branches, connecting us all, even before we are aware of it. We are a part of something greater than ourselves, drawn into this divine web of grace by a God who is always reaching out to us. Luke echoes this in the book of Acts, where he says, "In him we live, we move, and we have our being." God is not far from any one of us. He is ever present, knitting together the fabric of our lives in ways we cannot always see or understand. It is a great mystery, but it is one we can sense, like the deep, unseen roots of a tree spreading through the soil of our existence, grounding us in ever-present grace. But there are times in our life when we feel that connection more deeply, when the space between the divine and the human feels especially thin. The ancient Celtic Christians called these experiences thin places. These were not just physical locations, but moments when the boundary between heaven and earth seemed to almost disappear, when God's presence felt closer, more real. And I believe that thin places are not limited to sacred mountains or holy sites, but can be found in the spaces between us, in our relationships, and in the simple, everyday moments of life. Every conversation where we truly listen to each other, every act of kindness that is given or received, every shared moment of joy or grief becomes a thin place. These are the moments when the mystical presence of God binds us together, when grace flows freely between us, and we are reminded of the deep connection that we share, not only with one another, but with God himself. Have you ever felt that? Perhaps in a moment of unexpected compassion, a kind word that touched your heart, or a shared silence that speaks volumes. When my wife died, I felt that just sitting here in the church, just being around all of you, just the presence. These are the moments when we feel deeply connected, both to one another and to the great connector himself. And in these thin places, we are reminded of the great mystical nature of our faith. We experience the full reality of God's grace holding us together, an invisible force that sustains and connects us, whether we are aware of it or not. And yet, these moments don't have to be grand or extraordinary. In fact, it is often in the smallest actions, the ones we might overlook, that these thin places emerge. A single kind word, 10 seconds of a listening ear, a moment of forgiveness. These small gestures, these seemingly insignificant moments, become sacred because they create space for God's grace to flow. Every small action we take has the potential to create a thin place, a place where heaven and earth meet, where God's grace becomes visible, and where our connections are deepened and made holy. And this leads us to consider the power of small actions. How many of these thin places are created by the simple acts of love and service that we often take for granted. As we reflect on these thin places, we realize that they are often formed by tiny actions. These actions may seem small, but in the eyes of God, no action is insignificant. Just a single conversation can open the door to deeper connection. So too can a small act of kindness ripple through our lives and the lives of others in ways we cannot see. Jesus teaches us a broader lesson. It is often in these smallest deeds, done with great love, that the largest impact happens in our world. But in the same way, small action can also lead to great harm. In our Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verse 43, Jesus specifically says, "If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire." And Jesus again speaks here not of grand events, but of small parts of ourselves: a hand, a foot, an eye. Sometimes in the grand scheme of our lives, they may seem relatively small, but they can lead to great destruction. Jesus calls us to vigilance over the smallest parts of our lives because they have the power to make immense change or to lead us away from God. They can have a profound impact on our connection with God and with others. Jesus continues this challenge with this phrase, "For everyone will be salted with fire." Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Now, to the world of Jesus' time, salt was not merely a seasoning. It was precious. It was vital to life. Salt preserved. It kept things from decay. It gave food its flavor, protected what was good. Without salt, food spoiled. Without salt, things withered and wasted away. So when Jesus speaks of salt, his disciples understood what he was saying. This salt is essential. It is life-giving. But Jesus was speaking of something far greater than just food. He was speaking of our souls, our character, and our connections to one another. Salt represents what preserves the goodness in us, what keeps our spirits alive, what keeps our relationships from decaying. Salt is that unseen element that holds us together, that keeps us from falling into spiritual ruin. And now we have a warning. If it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? He is warning us about what happens when we lose the very thing that gives us life and meaning. If we neglect the small actions, if we fail to love, to serve, to forgive, and to listen, then we lose our spiritual saltiness. We lose what gives us flavor. We lose what gives us depth, what holds us together in community and connection with God. And once that saltiness is gone, once we let our hearts grow cold and indifferent to each other, it is difficult, oh so difficult, to regain that. Small actions keep us salted. Small actions are what preserve the goodness in us. They are what keep our relationships strong. They are what guard our community from spiritual decay. But Jesus doesn't just stop there. He says, "Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." Do you hear this? We are not meant to walk this road alone. We are called to salt one another, to help preserve the goodness in each other. We are called to watch over one another in love. We are called to keep each other spiritually sharp spiritually alive. This is what it means to cherish our connections with God and with each other. And this is no mere metaphor. This plays out in our everyday lives. How our cherishing connections in our own community leads to significant change, to the preservation of our salts. Over the past several years, some of you have been involved with Justice in Action and with our listening groups as the starting point of this action. These listening groups begin as simple conversations where we sit down with our neighbors and listen to their concerns. What keeps them up at night? What are their struggles? What are their fears? It may seem like just a small thing, showing up, just listening. But these small acts of listening have laid the foundation for systemic change. Through these listening sessions, we uncover issues in our community that need addressing: housing issues, mental health care issues, racial inequality issues, criminal justice issues. Small actions like attending a listening group lead to research, proposals, and ultimately major policy change. What starts as a conversation becomes a movement for justice that holds our leaders accountable. Small actions ripple outward, and before we know it, lives are being transformed. Injustices are being addressed, and God's grace is fully at work. You may feel like your contribution is small, but in the hands of God, it is incredibly powerful. Every small action, every choice to listen, every time you show up for someone else, it matters. It matters to them, and it matters to God. These small actions have eternal significance because they are a part of God's work of justice and love. So let us not underestimate the impact of small actions. Let us cherish these connections. Let us cherish these small moments, knowing that in the hands of God, even the smallest gesture can ripple through eternity. So as we come to the close of this message, let us reflect on the ways in which God's grace works in our lives, preparing us, sustaining us, and growing us. Before we ever sought God, He sought us. Prevenient grace is this light that shines into every single heart, the invitation that calls each of us into a relationship with Him. God lays the foundation for every connection, both with Him and with others, and we are invited to respond. Justifying grace brings us into a relationship with God Himself. When we accept His invitation, we are made new, reconciled to Him through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Our connection to God is not of our own making. It is a gift of His justifying grace. And sanctifying grace is the ongoing work of God's Spirit in our lives, transforming us, pruning what needs to be removed, and nurturing what needs to grow. Every small act of faithfulness, every choice to love, every step toward holiness is an act of sanctifying grace. We are called to cherish the connections that God has given us, to protect these connections, to nurture them, and to allow God's grace to transform them. Just as the branches rely on the vine for life, we rely on God's grace to sustain and grow our spiritual and communal connections. This week, I challenge you to reflect on your own connections, your connection with God, your connections with others, your connection with yourself. Where are the small places in your life that need attention? What are the small actions you can take to cherish and grow these connections? Perhaps it is spending just 5 more seconds in prayer. Perhaps it's reaching out to a loved one or offering forgiveness where it is needed. But remember, in God's kingdom, no action is too small to make a difference. So let us go forth, trusting in the grace of God, the great connector, who sustains us, transforms us, and guides us every step of the way. Amen.